up place just a little bit bigger. Settings to click. A slight adjustment of the chair. All right, so I think that puts everything into proper place. So we are going to get started. I know we're only 1 minute late, which feels early, but we've got a lot of a very big, very heavy topics to cover. Well, that might sound surprising since Tazria is a topic that most people, well, don't spend a lot of time on. Many people will look at Tazria and say, oh, we're just getting into all the purity legislation. Now I've got more to say about that when I released the video for my latest prayerful meditation on that which is tameh and that which is tahor, that which is ritually impure and that which is ritually pure. But there are some underlying concepts in all of this, both Tazria and Metzor in particular, that raise many questions that need to be raised and need to be investigated. So we are going to pick up at chapter 13, and we are going to get a little tour under our belt, and then we are going into a deep dive, not per se on the topic of Metzor itself. That is something I have covered multiple times in other study sessions. I will point out that this particular translation does still use the term leprosy, unfortunately, whereas Sara'at, the disease that a person is suffering from, is most definitely not leprosy. But we are not going to go into the ins and outs of how that comes and why it happens for its particular reasons. We're going to look at the bigger question of what this means for the community and for us as individuals. But with that as an intro, let's get down to work with a little Torah first. So chapter 13, the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, starting with verse 1, the very familiar beginning. Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has the skin on the body, when a person has on the skin of the body a swelling, a rash, or a discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affection on the skin of the body, it shall be reported to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the priests. All right, now we've already got this phrase, scaly affliction, which is sara'at, which we are going to eventually call leprosy. It would have been much more appropriate to use the term consistently throughout. It's one of the problems with some translations. But basically we say, here's a person going about their normal life, and there is some form of discoloration, swelling, rash on their body, and they need to go to the Kohen to find out what it is. And then, well, let's get into it and then we'll see what it is. Verse 3. The priest shall examine the affection on the skin of the body. If hair in the affected patch has turned white and the affection appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, it is sara'at, it is leprous. Again, not actual medical leprosy, but we will put up with the translation we have. When the priest sees it, he shall pronounce the person impure. But if it is a white discoloration on the skin of the body, which does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall isolate the affected person for 7 days. Already you should be recognizing that we have a dichotomy here, which is of significant theological importance. In verse 3, we are talking about if they actually can identify this as being sara'at, then the person becomes impure. Now, impure, as I have said 1,000 times, and I'm sure we'll say 10,000 times before I am done being a rabbi at the end of days, impure does not mean bad. Impure does not mean dirty. Impure does not mean contaminated. Impure means that they are blocked from certain ritual actions, most notably coming to the altar, the temple, or Mishkan in this case, and from partaking of certain types of food that are ritually pure or must be eaten while ritually pure. And that means that this person has had a shift in their religious status, their religious standing. This is an interruption of their ability to partake and participate in certain religious rites. yes, there is an element of, being able to transmit that status to another person. But that is not about contamination of a physical, organic, biological, chemical agent. It is about the other person coming into contact with the person who is suffering from this problem. The same way that if you are, if you encounter somebody who distresses you at work, you will often come home with a very different attitude than if you had not encountered them. So too, a person who encounters or comes into contact with somebody suffering from tzara'at will have a different state of mind. They will be shaken spiritually. And that means that they, to a lesser degree than the original person, him or herself, will have a different status, that there will be a lesser degree of ritual impurity for that other person. They don't have to go through the rigmarole. But with that, it is then apparent that there are certain things that are not tzara'at, meaning that it's not if you have any illness whatsoever, go to the Kohen, go to the priest. It's if you have this type of illness, go to the Kohen. If it meets a particular set of criteria, very, very specific levels of symptoms, then it is labeled as tzara'at. If it doesn't, then there is a period of watching, of making sure that it isn't actually tzara'at, which implies, I can't even say this how strongly, that most of it is not tzara'at, meaning most of the illnesses a person might have are just illnesses. Now, it's up to you whether you would be happier or disappointed if you went to the priest and the priest says, oh no, that's not tzara'at, you've actually got medical leprosy. You better go talk to the doctor. But that is what we are seeing here, that there is a particular set of symptoms which, under the priest's evaluation, will indicate this spiritual issue of tzara'at and all of the ritual impurity issues, which are completely different than any hygiene or sanitary issues or concerns. Or the person is afflicted by an actual medical condition, which might trigger sanitary or medical concerns. So, for example, somebody who is suffering from an infectious disease is not going to be labeled as ritually impure, but somebody who is suffering from an infectious disease is certainly going to be put into a different type of quarantine or a cordon of policies and procedures to try and keep it from spreading. So we can see right here off the bat, we are not talking about just a biological thing. In fact, the biological is confirmed by the fact that not everything is tzara'at, not everything is this. There are many things that will afflict people that cannot be treated by the Kohen and do not render a person ritually impure. Before we move on, I just want to make sure does everyone get that point? Just unmute or show an indication if you're still confused. Otherwise, we'll move on, but I just really want to make sure that is clear. So we spent the last 2 years dealing with an actual biological infectious disease. I want to make sure that people do not think that when we talk about tzara'at, we are talking about an analog for COVID or any other type of physical illness. Okay, verse 5. This is the person, remember, who it is not clearly tzara'at, but it might be tzara'at. And so they are undergoing a 7-day period of waiting to see. On the 7th day, the priest shall conduct an examination. And if the affection has remained unchanged in color and the disease has not spread on the skin, the priest shall isolate that person for another 7 days. No change, still there. Okay, we need more time. Verse 6. On the 7th day, the priest shall again conduct an examination. If the affection has faded and not spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce the person pure. It is a rash. It's just a physical skin condition, and those are incredibly common in the ancient world, or really up into the pre-modern world, and even in our world, a rash or skin condition is one of the more common medical conditions a person can have. It is then a rash, and after washing those clothes, that person shall be pure. But if the rash should spread on the skin after the person has been seen by the priest and pronounced pure, that person shall again report to the priest. Perhaps it is tzara'at after all, but they'll have to come back again, even though in the intermediate time they would have been rendered pure by proclamation. And if the priest sees that the rash has spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce the person impure. It is leprosy. It is tzara'at. So the priest is trying to make this determination. Some of it will be easy and obvious. Some of it will take time and examination. And of course, it can happen back and forth. And verse 9, we'll finish up what we're doing here. When a person has a scaly affection, it shall be reported to the priest. When you notice something that looks like this, then you have to come to the priest in order that an examination can be done. If you have a different type of physical ailment, a sprained leg or a broken arm, you don't go to the Kohen, you go to the doctor or whoever you have that can do anything about it back in the days before we had a well-established medical profession. Okay, hopefully I've made that a little clearer than it might have felt at first. As always, you can find out much more detail by reading the commentary. If you want more of the halacha, the laws of all of this, I can highly recommend reading through Rambam or Sefer HaChinuch, which will give you, Sefer HaChinuch will give you more of an overlay. Rambam will give much more detail, and you can get all of the ins and outs about how this works. But you will see, as the introduction here is kind of laid out, that what we are trying to do is make a determination. Is this a very particular type of condition that is triggered by a spiritual issue, ones that are discussed in the commentary and in previous classes that I've conducted, or is this just your run-of-the-mill disease? And if it's your run-of-the-mill disease or infection or any other kind of problem, you don't go to the Kohen, and the Kohen isn't going to cure it. Now that is where we have to then pick up, because that means that the Kohen is not going to cure your infected cut on your arm, that the Kohen is not going to cure your actual leprosy. The Kohen is not going to cure your cholera, your typhoid, your diphtheria, or any of the other illnesses that plagued humanity at this time period. The Kohen has nothing to do about that. That's not in their department. They're going to point to doctors, which up until the 20th century mostly, the best you could have hoped for would have been a nice bloodletting. Maybe some herbs that made you feel better, but not a lot that would have done to actually cure the illness in most places for most of our history. Which means we have to ask the question, if God is giving us this whole way of trying to deal with tzara'at and this spiritual illness and ailment, and if the Torah recognizes that that's not the only kind of affliction and suffering that can come to a person, why do suffering and problems come to people? Right, tzara'at, we've got discussion of. Like I said, in previous classes and all the commentary, we'll talk about the issue of tzara'at often being rooted within issues of jealousy or greed or selfishness or slander and gossip. There are many other explanations for why tzara'at will come to a person. But why did your paper cut get infected? Why did you break your hip when you fell? Why did this person suddenly get a problem with their liver? The Kohen just shrugs, apparently. And we ask, well, wait, why do we get problems with our livers at all? Why are there these other problems? We get an explanation for this one, but then it's silent on anything else. What's going on here? Now, I went into the topic of how we approach healing in much more detail last Sunday in one of our programs down in Lake Nona. And it was a great group and an amazing discussion. Anyone who wants a copy of the text, I'd be more than happy to send you the different texts we studied. But I want to move beyond the question of what do we do once it actually happens to why does it happen in the first place? And how do we relate to suffering in general? Not only of disease, but of poverty or deprivation or war or other issues that unfortunately seem to occur in the world. And to do that, we are going to have to think hard. And by think hard, I mean, we are going to jump into Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed. So it may not surprise you to know that you're not the first person to be confused by this. And that, in fact, people throughout our centuries have been perplexed by this, as well as many other theological questions in the world of why is there suffering? And what do we make of it? And how do we relate to it? And how do we understand it in order to be able to appreciate us, God, our world, and everything else. And for my money, Rambam, despite the clunkiness of translating from Arabic to Hebrew when Hebrew went to English, and then the translations mostly being the ones that are available of older English, with a little work, a little massaging, and a lot of work, a lot of thinking, provides some excellent insights. Now, we're only going to do some excerpts. Still going to take a while. Still going to take a lot of hard thought. But I always recommend you go back to the section of Moreh Nevuchim. It's here at the beginning of part 3 of the Guide for the Perplexed. And it is something that takes effort. And I'm always open for a discussion or even to read it together with someone if you're getting a little lost. But it is incredibly worthwhile for not only this topic, for many others. And I have had to do a few excerpts because otherwise we never would finish within our 1 hour time slot. So let's begin with sort of a general understanding of what it is to be human. And so we're going to begin here. We're in part 3 of the Guide for the Perplexed, chapter 9. I like to joke that if Rambam had started the Guide for the Perplexed with part 3, he probably would have gotten a lot more readers. Part 1 is a very technical section dealing with terms and vocabulary throughout the Tanakh and trying to show what they mean in context in order to rule out wrong notions. But it is very dry to those that are not interested in philosophy in general, or those who have never been particularly perplexed by issues of saying that God winked or God saw or God's hand. Whereas part 3 in particular starts dealing with some big picture items and questions that I think everyone has at some point. And you can just jump to part 3. It's okay. Read a little bit there, be a little confused, but also get some insight. Let's see what we can do together. The physical element in man is a large screen and partition that prevents him from perfectly perceiving abstract ideals. This would be the case even if the corporeal, the physical element, were as pure and superior as the substance of the sphere. So as I'll interrupt and try and explain as we go. When he talks about the spheres, he is talking about a Aristotelian view of cosmology, of the world, with the idea that the Earth, being the center, is surrounded by crystalline spheres, physical structures that house the different planets and the sun and the moon and the stars. This was their idea of the ever higher levels of perfection of the physical world away from our very flawed and imperfect level of the physical world. But that cosmology aside, which I'm sure Rambam would be the first to point out is no longer applicable because we figured out a lot more about how space works, the point he is making is still absolutely correct. That we are physical creatures, we are physical beings, and being physical creates a barrier. It creates a blinder when we try to understand things that are beyond us, things that are abstract, and things that are very different than our physical existence. Even if we had that elevated sphere type construction where the purest material possible, it would still be hard. How much more must this be the case with our dark and opaque body? We are pretty dense. However, the great exertion of our mind may be to comprehend the divine being or any of the ideals. We find a screen and partition between him and ourselves. Try as hard as you want, there will always be a barrier. Only Moses was able to pierce further, but even he still had final levels that could not be comprehended because he still was a human being. He still was a physical entity. And we should try, and we can get further than we would start than if we didn't try at all, but recognize there will always be this limit. Now, that idea of our corporeality, our humanity, our physicality is going to be very important. So don't forget that as we go on. You know that he who removes the obstacle of motion is, to some extent, the cause of the motion. If one removes the pillar which supports the beam, he causes the beam to move. All right, so Rambam is laying up a few pieces here, and I apologize for having to bring only a short example of this. He's saying, if there is a beam up there and I move the pillar, I didn't actually move the beam, but by moving the support, I am actually causing the beam to move, kind of. Now, I'm not exerting any influence over the beam. I'm not pulling it down with my magic powers, and I'm certainly not gravity itself, but I am involved in its movement because of my removing of the pillar. And so in this sense, we say of him who removed a certain property that it produced the absence of that property, although the absence of the property is nothing positive. A positive here is not like positive, negative in the sense of good and bad. Positive here is saying that it isn't, I didn't do anything, I didn't add anything to the world, I didn't exert an influence directly on the world. All I did was remove something, right? I produced the absence of something. And so that production of an absence can create a, what we would call a negative, but technically isn't actually a thing, right? The absence of the beam is causing the motion, but the absence of the beam technically isn't anything. It's just not there. Just as we say of him who puts out the light at night, that he has produced darkness, so we say of him who destroyed the sight of any being that he produced blindness, although darkness and blindness are negative properties and require no actor. So what he's saying is, you don't actually ever make darkness. If I blow out my candle, I am not making darkness. All I am doing is removing light. And by removing light, its absence, we call darkness. Now, that notion that there are no negative properties in the world, there are no things that actually destroy, but things that simply are what we call the absence of something that is positive, that exists, that its non-existence we call something else. We call sight sight when people can see, and we call the non-existence of sight blindness, but blindness itself technically isn't a thing. It is merely the absence of the thing called sight. So that's the principle that he's trying to get across here. Because in accordance with this view, we explain the following passage of Isaiah, which confuses many people. I form the light and create, borei, darkness. I make peace and korate, borei, evil. For darkness and evil are non-existent things. How can we say that God creates darkness when darkness isn't a thing? Well, what that means is that there are impediments to darkness, light, that if they are removed, create the experience that we call darkness, which is merely the negation, the absence of light. So too, when we talk about peace and when we talk about evil, evil isn't a thing. Evil doesn't exist in and of itself. Badness isn't around, and more on that in just a second. It is simply what we call a situation with the absence of what is good. In this case, being paired with the phrase shalom. And remembering peace is a much more holistic and greater view than just not war, but instead everything that is good in life. So when we talk about God creating evil, we're not talking about God setting out demons and devils and forces of malevolence in the world. We are saying there are times where God does not prevent the reduction of goodness, and that means we then live in a position where either for ourselves or for society as a whole, things are bad. Now, just a moment before we continue, because we're going to talk about evil a lot, we have to decouple the phrase evil from our English baggage, because in English, evil has this very physical, tangible connotation. Evil has been given a home in a physical location called hell. Evil has been given an actor called the devil, and evil is something that we consider to be a palpable force in the world. That is not what Rambam is saying. He just said the exact opposite. And that is not the way Judaism always defines the word evil. Evil here is being defined more in a classical English sense, which it is an older translation, in the sense of badness or harm. Now, sometimes that evil is because we are working in the exact opposite of God's will, what we would call like actual, murderous type evil, the horror film type evil. But sometimes it's just, the evil that happened on my vacation means that the train was late. It was just a bad thing. It was harmful to me, but it's not malevolent. It's not intentional, and it certainly has no spiritual agenda. So as we go through, please try to understand that when we use the term evil in this translation, we are not talking about actual wickedness for the most part. There'll be a couple places where we talk about things that we would call wicked in modern English, but for most part, you can substitute the word bad or harm for evil, and it will get you a better understanding. But because that word covers a wide range, I decided to leave that as our translation. Okay, onward or we'll never get done. Evils are evils. Harm is harm, bad is bad, only in relation to a certain thing. Meaning it's relative. And that which is evil in reference to a certain existing thing either includes the non-existence of that thing, it's not there, and if I'm the thing and I'm suddenly not there, like, dead, I'm going to be upset by that, or the non-existence of some of its conditions. The proposition has therefore been laid down in the most general terms: all evils are negations. And then he gives a few examples. Thus, for a man, death is evil. Death is his non-existence. I don't want to be dead. It would be bad because I want to exist. And if I stop existing, the negation of my existence, I would call that bad. Now, note, nothing was actually created by my death. It's not anything new in the world. It's just the absence of life that creates that experience. Illness, poverty, and ignorance are evils for men. All of these are privations of properties. Right? Being ignorant isn't a thing. It is simply the opposite of being wise. Being poor isn't a thing. It is the opposite of having enough. Being sick isn't a thing. It simply is the opposite of having a properly working body. All of these things are the negative of what is actually good in the world. And that means that, again, it's going to sound weird, evil doesn't exist. Evil is merely the opposite of what things are supposed to be when they are in their proper place and working in their proper way. After these propositions, it must be admitted as a fact that it cannot be said of God that he directly creates evil, or he has the direct intention to produce evil. This is impossible. His works are all perfectly good. What God makes is good. The negation of what God has made is what we would call bad. He only produces existence, and all existence is good, whilst evils are of a negative character and cannot be acted upon. There isn't a thing there. Evil can only be attributed to him in the way we have mentioned, like removing the pillar. He creates evil only insofar as he produces the corporeal element, such as it actually is. Talk about that in a second. It is always connected with negatives and is on that account the source of all destruction and all evil. Those beings that do not possess this corporeal element are not subject to destruction or evil. So consequently, the true work of God is all good, since it is existence. All right. What God made was existence. Existence has certain properties. Those properties can be negated. When those properties are negated, it's not nice. It's terrible. And that's what we experience as being bad, evil, or harm in the world. Now, how do we then relate to that as an individual? How do we take this and use it as an actual guide or understanding in order to relate to the harm in the world? Because just telling somebody evil doesn't really exist, it's just a negative, well, philosophically, intellectually, I might be able to understand that, but emotionally, spiritually, what is that asking of me to do? How do I take that information and use it to relate to the world in a way that will help improve my ability to avoid evil, but also to overcome the evil that occurs? And that's where we're headed next. All the great evils which men cause to each other because of certain intentions, desires, opinions, or religious principles are likewise due to non-existence. So now we're not talking about the stuff God does, we're talking about the stuff we do and the things we do to each other in particular. And they are also due to non-existence because they originate in ignorance, which is the absence of wisdom. A lot of the bad stuff that happens was caused by other people, and it was caused by other people who had a lack of wisdom. His example, a blind man, for example, who has no guide stumbles constantly because he cannot see and causes injury and harm to himself and others. In the same manner, various classes of men, each man in proportion to his ignorance, brings great evil upon themselves and upon other individual members of the species. If men possessed wisdom, which stands in the same relation to the form of man as the sight to the eye, they would not cause any injury to themselves or to others, for the knowledge of truth removes hatred and quarrels and prevents mutual injuries. So if you take away nothing else from today, take away that last sentence. If you want to know the way to proportionally reduce the most amount of evil in the world, help people stop being stupid. Help people have wisdom and find it for yourself. By coming to classes like this and other study, find ways to understand the world better, and you will find that hatred and quarrels and other types of problems will diminish, and that will cause the self-inflicted and cross-inflicted injury to be reduced. That is the simplest message to take from what we're doing today. That if you want to understand why there are so many problems in the world, it is because so many people behave stupidly, but that can be fixed. That can actually be improved. And so that is job number one. However, we need to look at the world a little bit more than that, because not everything in the world is like that. And why are people so ignorant? And what sort of techniques and tips can we have to overcome that ignorance that will provide the easiest avenues to avoid much of this injury and self-harm? So, onward. Oh, come on. Sometimes the mouse wheel gets a little off. Men frequently think that the evils in the world are more numerous than the good things. Many sayings and songs of the nations dwell on this idea. And boy, don't I know it. How many people have I heard that the world is always terrible, the world is bad, there are more bad people, there aren't enough good people, that's the problem in the world, blah, 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 blah. Well, at least since Rambam's day, 1,000 years ago, that's what other people were saying, and I am afraid it is much older than Rambam as well. However, well, we're going to see that's not right, but let's continue their lament. They say that a good thing is found only exceptionally. It's so rare to find good things, while evil things are numerous and lasting. Not only common people make this mistake, but even many people who believe that they are wise. It's not just a question of the glass half full, the glass half empty. It's believing that there are thousands of glasses of poison and only one glass of water. The origin of this error is that people judge the whole universe by examining one single person. Who's that person? For an ignorant man believes that the whole universe only exists for him, as if nothing else required any consideration. If, therefore, anything happens to him, contrary to his expectation, he at once concludes that the whole universe is evil. And if that sounds incredibly modern, although in slightly older language, it's because you are human. We tend to look at the universe through the lenses that we've got in the front of our face. And we tend to judge the universe by our experiences as though that is it. And as everybody knows in intimate detail, all of the wrong, trouble, and strife that happens to them, and often overlooks the good and blessing that is being done for them, on average, most people think that the world is full of trouble and strife, because boy, don't they feel like their life is full of trouble and strife. If, however, he would take into consideration the whole universe, form an idea of it, and comprehend what a small portion he is, he will find the truth. Just think for just 1 second. We'll put aside the whole universe. We don't need to compare you to black holes and quasars, but just for a second, compare yourself to the other 7+ billion people on this planet. Do you really think that your personal experience, however many years you've been alive and however much you've been able to experience, that that's the totality of humanity's experience? That no one else is experiencing anything different than you? No one else has any different perspective on this? No one else has any different understanding of this? That what you know is what it is to be human? Really? Just you? Because you are the greatest observer of all of human nature. You are the paradigm. You are the pinnacle. You are the avatar of what it is to be human. Really? You? How lucky it is to be you. to be the one who has that true perspective and everyone else is ignorant and wrong. How lucky it is to be you, to be that chosen one. Rambam saying, look, you're no one special. You're a human like everyone else, and you are having experiences like everyone else, and your experiences are no more unique than anyone else's experiences, and your perspective on them is no wiser than the perspective of anyone else. And he goes on to continue in this musing of what a person like this might say. They wonder that a person who became leprous in consequence of bad foods, and that's actual leprosy, they ate something, they were involved in eating things that were infected or unsanitary, and they get sick. They wonder that such a person would be inflicted with so great an illness and suffer such a misfortune. Why is it that a person who just happened to eat, 3 weeks old pork happens to get trichinosis? I mean, come on, the world is so unfair. Or that he who indulges in much sensuality as to weaken his sight should be struck with blindness and other type things. It is of great advantage that man should know his station and not erroneously imagine the whole universe exists only for him. We hold that the universe exists because the Creator wills it so. The universe isn't here because of you. The universe is here because of God. And as we saw back in our very first text, you ain't God, and you can't understand God perfectly because you are part of the creation, not the Creator. The numerous evils to which an individual persons are exposed are due to the defects existing in the person themselves. We're going to come back to that defects. It does not mean we always blame every person who suffers. I know that's what we've seen so far, but Rambam is going to be a little more general than that in a minute. But I just want to head that off before anyone gets the wrong notion. This is not about blaming a child cancer patient, God forbid. This is about saying defects, which, as we'll see, are intrinsic in simply being a physical creation. Not defects of character, as is often used. We complain and seek relief from our own faults. We suffer from the evils which we, by our own free will, inflict on ourselves and ascribe them to God, who is far beyond being connected with them. Now, a lot going on in that sentence. He is here talking about the self-inflicted types of evils, the kind of person who runs around being a jerk and then doesn't understand why they have no friends, and then has the temerity to blame God for it. God, why did you make this world and make people so bad? Why is no one my friend, no matter how much I kick them? That is the ignorance that Rambam is railing against here. The people who create problems for themselves, then lament those problems as though that is typical of the world, and then blame God for those problems when it is not God who created those problems. It is them, by embracing and not failing to remove the defects in their own life and personality. We are going to get in just a second to other types of defects and other things that go on with what it is to be human. But I just want to pause there as we do a quick check to see if people have questions, if I've lost everyone, and I'll have a quick sip of tea. This is some tough love that Rambam is giving. He is not mincing words. I don't think his book would fly off the self-help shelf in the Barnes & Noble, because most people don't like being told that a lot of the problems you experience are your own problems, that you made them, and it's not fair to blame God for them. And in many cases, it's not fair to blame others. But exactly why these problems exist and the different types, some that are not our problems and some that are beyond our control, Rambam wants us to understand those as well. So he's going to break up the types of evils, the harms in the world, into 3 distinct categories. And this is something that is not always going to be helpful to a person going through a crisis at the moment. But if you study it, reflect upon it, and try to embrace the understanding of these 3 different problems, then when you face problems, you will often be able to find consolation and spiritual support when you are faced with them, or indeed be able to recognize in many cases that it's not a problem. But let's divide these 3 types of evils, these 3 types of harm, badness in the world. The first kind is that which is caused to man by the circumstance that he is subject to creation and destruction. That is, he possesses a body. All right, right out the bat, a lot of the problems that we suffer are because we exist. And we exist as a physical creature. right? I'm made up of molecules and atoms and all these working bits in me that work lesser or worse. And that is because I am made of something that is made. I am a structure that is created. And by definition, which Rambam goes on in much more detail in other parts of his book, anything that is made can be destroyed. That is a function of creation, destruction. They are necessary for each other. We'll get a hint more of that in a second. It is on account of the body that some persons happen to have great deformities or paralysis of some of the organs. Right? This evil may be a part of the natural constitution of these persons, or may have been developed subsequently in consequence of changes in the elements. You might be born with an infirmity, with a deformity, with an illness, with a lack of easy life, right? Because you're made up of stuff, and sometimes that stuff gets put together, and it doesn't always fit together just right. And when it doesn't fit together just right, then it's much harder to go on living without the handicap that's creating. Or sometimes all your stuff was in the rightish place, but something happened later on. You got hit by lightning, right? A tree fell on your leg. You were attacked by a lion, and now you're not working so well because some of your stuff got hurt by some of the other stuff of the world. In accordance with divine wisdom, creation can only take place through destruction. And without destruction, the individual members of the species themselves would not exist permanently. Thus, the true kindness and beneficence and goodness of God is clear. Right. If you want to exist, if you want there to be existence at all, then you have to accept and understand that creation and destruction are two sides of the same coin. There cannot be you without something else being broken. Do you think you were made up out of parts that were invented from, magic? No, you were made up of parts that were part of something else at some part in the universe's history. You were made up of bits of old stars that had gone through their cycle and died. You are made up of bits of plants that have been ground up. You are made up of bits of animals that have gone through decay and turned into nutrients that create that whole process. You are made up of other stuff that has been broken. And that's the only way it works. If there is going to be change, meaning you can exist, because otherwise without change, only that which existed once would be able to exist, then you are going to also be made up of things that can break, and that is going to cause problems. He who thinks that he can have flesh and bones, meaning can exist, without being subject to any external influence, without problems, or any of the accidents of matter, its breaking, unconsciously wishes to reconcile two opposites, to be at the same time subject and not subject to change. I want to exist, which is a change in the universe, but I don't want any part of me to get hurt or break or damaged. Well, that doesn't work. You have to have both. If you want to exist, you have to be able to be broken, because nothing gets made that isn't made, and anything made can be broken. If a man were never subject to change, there could be no generation, no life, no creation. There would be one single being, but no individuals forming a species. Right? If it was just boink, God created one man, and that man was made out of a perfect static construction, well then, how would that person make another person? That other person would have to be, at the very least, different than them, and that other person would have to be, well, part of them. But if part of them was taken to be used to make something else, then they are now less. They are imperfect. They have changed. And that means they're not this perfect, unchanging structure. For life to exist, there has to be destruction. And that is the centerpiece of creation. All right, onward. It is therefore impossible that a man should be free from this species of evil. This type of harm, the harm that comes from just being made up of stuff, this will always exist. You will nevertheless find that the evils of the above kind which befall man are very few and rare. You will find countries that have not been flooded or burned for thousands of years. There are thousands of men in perfect health. Deformed individuals are a rare occurrence. They are not 100th or even 1,000th part of those that are perfectly normal. Now, we can argue about his terminology of perfectly normal. I believe there is much more variety than he was aware of in the physical construction of human beings. But then I have 1,000 years of research and science that Rambam was not privy to. But his basic definition and his basic assertion is correct. That by and large, the human species goes on with most of us being able to live a relatively comfortable life, even if there is minor differences in the construction of each of us. And by and large, we are not constantly subjected to floods and fires that are destroying our homes, our lives on a daily basis. Those kinds of things are essentially rare. Yes, they get all the news attention, and yes, we remember them more than we remember all of the not burning and flooding. But if you sit down and do the math, you recognize that as a matter of fact, most of humanity in the 99 percentile and most of our days, again, in the 99 percentile, are free of actual catastrophic problems that come from us being physical creatures. And to complain about that as though somehow this is a great sin against us, that God allows us to have a stubbed toe while also not sending floods and fires constantly, well, that is simply misunderstanding what it means to be a physical human creature. If you want no stubbed toes, then you do not want to exist, because by existing, you are going to stub your toe. All right, second class of evil as we come into the home stretch. This is the shortest of the two. The second class of evil are those people caused to each other, right? Man versus man, human versus human. We cause lots of trouble to each other when some of them use their power against others. These evils are more numerous than those of the first kind. Their causes are numerous and known. They likewise originate in ourselves, though the sufferer himself cannot avoid them. So there is more human-to-human problem, more human-to-human harm and evil than there are floods and fires and illness in the world. That we cause more daily destruction and harm to one another than is caused by the natural world around us on our bodies. And this is hard because the person who is being beaten up in the street, the person that is being robbed, the person that is being treated terribly, oftentimes they're not in the position to stop it any more than they could stop a flood because it is being done by others who are abusing their power of humanity. However, as he points out, this kind of evil is nevertheless not widespread in any country of the whole world. It is of rare occurrence that a man plans to kill his neighbor or to rob him of his property by night. Many persons are afflicted with this kind of evil in great wars, but these are not frequent if the whole inhabited part of Earth is taken into consideration. So again, we're getting perspective here. We are getting a reminder here that yes, this evil does exist, and yes, this evil is caused by each other, to each other, but honestly, we're not murdering each other left, right, and center. Even in many of the worst failed states, you still do not have most people being murdered or murderers. That simply doesn't happen on anything like a regular basis. Yes, in great wars, there can be a massive amount of murder, but if you look at the statistics of the human population curves, even things like the rampaging of Genghis Khan or the atrocities of World War I and World War II barely put a dent in the growing human population. There is a lot of death that happens, but as a proportion of humanity, it is smaller than you think. There is a lot of crime that still happens. As a proportion of experiences, it is less than you think. And that is what he is trying to help us to understand. We may think that there is more evil in the world than good because that is what fills up our news feeds, but that isn't actually the truth. Most people around the world will be born, live, and die without experiencing any extreme forms of this type of evil. Yes, they'll have trouble with someone at work. They might get into a scuffle with another kid on the playground and that sort of, baby step evil. But the big problems are not as constant as we pretend for them to be. And even when they are occurring, are often occurring to a smaller proportion of the human population than we think. It's especially hard to remember that when it's happening to you, but it's important to remember even when it happens to you, that this is not the nature of the world. This is a freak, aberrant behavior by the person causing the harm, rather than just, oh, that's what happens in life. Rambam, based off Judaism, does not want us to simply accept that the evil that we do to each other is just a normal part of existence and therefore unavoidable. Yes, some of it is unavoidable, but a lot of it can be fixed. Going back to our discussion at the very beginning of the necessity of wisdom to prevent this type of harm. And now we get to the third class, which is the largest type and the one that is perhaps the most important for us to reflect upon on a daily basis. The third class of evil comprises those which everyone causes to himself by his own action, self-inflicted harm. This is the largest class and is far more numerous. It is especially of these evils that all men complain. Only a few men that do not sin against themselves by this kind of evil. Solomon explains that this kind of evil is man's own work. This only I have found, he says in the book of Ecclesiastes, that God has made man upright, but they have thought out many inventions. And these inventions bring the evils upon him. Now, he's not talking about the light bulb here. He's talking about the fact that God gave us an upright spirit and gave us an upright guidance in life, and yet we choose to ignore them and go after our own imaginations, and those are what get us into trouble. But that is a little vague, so let's try and make that a little clearer. This class of evils originate in man's vices, such as excessive desire for eating, drinking, and sensuality, indulgence in these things in undue measure or an improper manner, or of partaking bad food. This course brings diseases and afflictions upon the body and soul alike. So the first category of the self-inflicted are the things that we do that are wrong. If you are the kind of person who overindulges, and then you find that you are going to your cardiologists more than you like, or that you are going to your nephrologist more than you like, if you are the kind of person who smoked 40 packs of cigarettes every day and now are finding that you need cancer treatment, well, duh. Doesn't mean I can't have sympathy for you, but are you really going to blame God for that? Are you really going to say it's unfair that God caused me to have this result? You are the kind of person who has cheated on your taxes and now the IRS is knocking on your door. Are you really going to complain about the evils of the IRS and how unfair it is that God makes them punish you rather than the real bad people in the world? Of course people do. And of course, Rambam is saying this is silly. Now, that idea of what afflictions come upon the soul from these self-inflicted problems, that needs more examination. The suffering of the body in consequence of these evil are well known. Those of the soul are twofold. First, such evils of the soul are the necessary consequence of the changes in the body, insofar as the soul is a force residing in the body. It has therefore been said that the property of the soul depends on the condition of the body. If you abuse your body through mistreating it by how you engage in the world around you, your soul will suffer. No, this is not some permanent damnation or taint. Please forget all of that. It comes from other religious ideas. This is your soul being twisted and bitter. This is the kind of problem that happened to our ancestors in Egypt. When Moses showed up and promised redemption, their ruach, their spirit, was so crushed that they couldn't even hear the potential for coming out, and they turned against him for a time. That is the type of crippling of the soul that can happen from the crippling of the body. And secondly, the soul, when accustomed to superfluous things, acquires a strong habit of desiring things which are neither necessary for the preservation of the individual nor for that of the species. If you get into the habit of having all of these overindulgences, then you get into your habit where your soul will be aching for these as well. And that power, that addiction, which isn't exactly a word that he would have understood in our modern sense, is a terrible burden for the soul to carry. Because, let me just scroll this down so I can get it back up in easier view of my glasses. This desire is without a limit, while things which are necessary are few in number and restricted within certain limits. Right? Desire for all of those additional indulgences can never be satiated. You desire to have you desire to have vessels of silver, but golden vessels are still better. So even if you have silver, you're still going to want more. Others have even vessels of sapphire, or perhaps they can be made of emerald or rubies or any other substance that could be suggested. You will always find that you want more if you think that you'll be satisfied with what you have, because there is always something better that could be had. And if your soul is now on this treadmill of acquisitiveness, of acquiring things for your satisfaction, then that will exhaust you and that will crush your spirit. Those who are ignorant and perverse in their thought are constantly in trouble and pain because they cannot get as much of superfluous things as certain other persons possesses. Why don't I have all the things someone else has? They've got insert fancy car, they've got insert fancy phone, they've got insert jewelry, vacation, fancy restaurant, whatever it might be. I wish I had that too. If only I had that. The lifestyles of the rich and famous. This is only going to cause you pain. If you are addicted to consumption, then you will always see that someone else consumed something you didn't, and that will only cause you misery. They, as a rule, then expose themselves to great dangers by sea voyage or service of kings, and all this for the purpose of obtaining that which is superfluous and not necessary. How many people put themselves, their family, their financial life at risk, chasing after one more turn of the roulette wheel? I'm sure this stock or this crypto is going to be the secret. Or maybe if I, did a little, drug dealing on the side, or engaged in a little bit of theft over here, or white collar crime over here, or cheated on this, then maybe I could get a little more. Then I'd have enough. But of course, you'll never have enough. When they thus meet with the consequences of the course which they adopt, they complain of the decrees and judgments of God. They begin to blame the time and wonder at the want of justice in its changes, that it has not enabled them to acquire great riches, with which they could buy large quantities of wine for the purpose of making themselves drunk, and numerous concubines adorned with various kinds of ornaments of gold, embroidery, and jewels, for the purpose of driving themselves to voluptuousness beyond their capacities, as if the whole universe existed exclusively for the purpose of giving pleasure to these low people. Are you really lamenting that God did not let you get enough money to drink yourself dead? Are you really lamenting that God did not give you the right to indulge yourself through the success of your crimes in order that you could suffer from the effects of syphilis or any other type of disease that might come from your behavior? God is so cruel that he didn't let you afflict the worst consequences to yourselves. And had God given you those that capacity, had God given you the wealth you were seeking in all of your illicit methods, and then you faced the actual inevitable consequences of those behaviors, you would then complain that God had cursed you with the consequences as well. This is the paradox of the world we live in, and especially in a level that I don't think Rambam could even comprehend in the 20th century, the way that we desire things that are unnecessary and how this creates this ache and pain within us. As we continue, I need to find my spot here. The error of the ignorant goes so far as to say that God's power is insufficient because he has given to this universe the properties which they imagine cause these great evils, and which do not help all evil-disposed persons to obtain the evil which they seek, and to bring their evil souls to the aims of their desires, though these, as we have shown, are really without limit. So people will even say, why didn't God create the world where I don't have to get sick, where I should be able to eat as much as I want, when I want, without worrying about heart disease and diabetes? Why didn't God make it so that I didn't have to be evil to get more money in order to be able to have these things? What's wrong with God's universe? Is God so stupid that this is the world he made? No, it's not God that's showing off the ignorance here. The virtuous and wise, however, see and comprehend the wisdom of God displayed in the universe. Thus David says, all the paths of the Lord are mercy and truth unto such as keep his covenant and his testimonies. Forced by the claims of the body, the wise seek that which is necessary for the preservation of the body, bread to eat and garment to clothe, and this is very little. But they seek nothing superfluous. With very slight exertion, man can obtain it, so long as he is contented with that which is indispensable. If you recognize what you truly need, and you work just enough to get what you need, rather than chasing after the bigger house, the fancier car, the promotion, the jewels, the vacation, all the things you can post on Instagram or Facebook and all of that, if you actually just content yourself with what you need, it's not that hard to be able to get it without too much exertion. All the difficulties and troubles we meet in this respect are due to the desire for superfluous things. When we seek unnecessary things, we have difficulty even in finding that which is indispensable. When we seek beyond our means, we find that even what we need becomes hard. How many people, I saw a story just recently about this, of a couple who make $500,000 a year together, still find that at the end of the year, they don't have enough for some basic necessities. Well, it's not that they don't have enough, it's that they have chosen to spend such a high proportion of what they have made, which is incredible wealth, on things that aren't actually needed before taking care of what is needed. And that is what often happens. When we seek the unnecessary, we often lose what is necessary. For the more we desire to have that which is superfluous, the more we meet with difficulties. Our strength and possessions are spent in unnecessary things and are wanting when required for that which is necessary. Observe how nature proves the correctness of this assertion. The more necessary a thing is for living beings, the more easily it is found and the cheaper it is. The less necessary it is, the rarer and clearer it is. Air, water, and food are indispensable to man. Air is the most necessary, for if man is without air for a short time, he dies, whilst he can be without water a day or two. Air is undoubtedly found more easily and cheaply, or indeed freely, no matter where you go. Water is more necessary than food, for some people can be 4 or 5 days without food, provided they have water. Water also exists in every country in larger quantities than food, and is also cheaper. Indeed, look at your water bill, not counting what you waste on your grass, but just what you drink, and look at your food bill, and your water bill will be a lot less than what your food bill is. The same proportion can be noticed in the different kinds of food. That which is more necessary in a certain place exists there in larger quantities and is cheaper than that which is less necessary. I have no end of people who wondered how in the world, when I lived in Japan for 3 years, I could get by on a very modest salary because wasn't food so expensive. And I explained to them, no, American food in Japan is expensive. Japanese food is very cheap. You can get great fish and great rice and eat wonderfully. I still miss their wonderful mushroom selections, which were readily available and dirt cheap. And as long as you ate from what was available there, you could eat for very reasonable amounts and have wonderful meals. And the same is true in America. If you want to eat according to what's available in large quantities in America, you can also eat very cheaply. On the other hand, if you wanted to import Japanese mushrooms, then you're going to be paying a lot more for that. No intelligent person considers musk, amber, rubies, and emerald as very necessary for man, except as medicines, which they believed in his time. And they, as well as other like substances, can be replaced for this purpose by herbs and minerals. And even then, he knew there were probably alternatives. This shows the kindness of God to his creatures, even to us weak beings. It is no wrong or injustice that one has many bags of finest myrrh and garments embroidered with gold, while another has not those things which are not necessary for our maintenance. He who has them has not thereby obtained control over anything that can be an essential addition to his neighbor, but has only obtained something illusory or deceptive. What have you gained by having the fancier car? What have you gained by having the fancier watch? Only something that you will now worry about and which will take more of your resources to maintain and protect. This is the ultimate trap that takes so much of our time and our worry and adds to our stress. If you recognize that if you have the minimum that is needed, that you already have enough, and that anything after that is simply something to be enjoyed or appreciated, but not something to be worried about or to be overly concerned with, it is much easier to weather any of the damage that could happen to all of those extraneous things. The other, who does not possess that which is not wanted for his maintenance, does not miss anything indispensable. If you have what you need to maintain your life in relative ease and comfort in this world, food, water, clean air, a decent roof over your house, over your head, decent clothes on your back to keep you protected from the elements. He that gathered much had nothing over. He that had gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. From the section of Exodus about the manna, that each may have gone for more or gone for less, but ultimately each were able to get what they needed. And anything you think you got in excess of your need, you don't actually possess. Instead, it becomes a master to you. The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies over all his works. From Ashrei. For it is an act of great and perfect goodness that he gave us existence. So far from complaining about the world being flawed and the world being more full of woe and misery, Judaism recognizes that this world has been created in a beautiful way, allowing us to exist with all of the potentials for problems that it creates, but also with wisdom to allow us to guide ourselves in this world so that we can weather most of the worst types of problems. Yes, there will be suffering, some caused by ignorance one to another, some caused by ignorance to ourselves, some caused by the fragility of our human condition. But ultimately, existence is a blessing, and we shouldn't have expected it to be any other way, and we certainly should not condemn God for any failures we have had of overcoming the limitations of being physical. We have made great strides in providing more food, more water, of cleaner existence, and more health to more people. But we're not done. And if those things continue to fall short, that is not a flaw within God's creation. That is flaw within our management of God's creation and ourselves. I apologize for dragging you over our time. I do try to be respectful of those of you who are on a limit because of your work or other commitments. But hopefully you appreciate this discussion. And as always, I cannot highly recommend Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed more. But if you have trouble with it, please let me know, and I'll be happy to help guide you through the guide.
Thank you, Rabbi. I was really focused this week on Rambam's very first comment in chapter 13, which was the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, and he discusses the fact that affliction and suffering is an issue that is subject to the priest's ruling. And I been thinking of this in the context of how do we be a priestly kingdom? And certainly, as you explained today, understanding the various causes and structures of human suffering is a critical part of that. Being sensitive to what is suffering, how is it manifested, where does it come from, it is a priestly duty, quite literally, because people with their afflictions are turning to the Kohanim and saying, help.
And that,
go ahead, that's it.
No, I was just going to say, and that is something that I want to make sure that everybody, despite the harshness of Rambam's terms, and perhaps even my own impassioned reading, doesn't walk away with the mistaken notion that we should condemn those that are suffering. Certainly those that are suffering from no cause of their own, obviously we wouldn't condemn them. But even those that are suffering from things that are man-made, which, as Rambam points out, is really the bulk of what is true suffering, even we shouldn't condemn, but we should help to escape from the suffering first, and help to escape from the ignorance that led to that suffering. That is a religious duty of ours. We don't say, well, you made your bed, lie in it. That is not a Jewish concept. Yes, we can understand that they made that bed that they are now lying in, but that doesn't mean that we leave them there and scoff at them. It means that as we pull them out, we recognize that in addition to the immediate material help they might need, we have to also give instruction in order to help them and others to avoid that pitfall in their own lives.
It is practical advice.
It is. Like most of what Rambam and philosophy and Jewish theology try to teach. But some people think that because it's in the Jewish thought section or philosophy section, that it isn't as practical as halakha. but I find this as stirring as any halakhic treatise and as meaningful for my spiritual growth as any of the more modern Musar books.
Oh, I agree. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everyone, and be well. A reminder for those who watch my class on Wednesday that I do not have the Mishnah class tonight because of a life cycle need within my community.